Okay, it's actually, the streaming is just building now. Okay, the live page is up.
Good evening, and welcome to part 2 of our symposium series, Homework. My name is Paul Steeples, and I will be hosting this evening. Today's focus is Globalized Digital Capitalism, and our speakers will be Dr. Irai Chaley, Dr. Karen Burns, and Professor Reinhold Martin. Before I introduce the theme and the first speaker, I'd like to run through the practicalities of this evening's discussion. Each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes and will be introduced by a member of the cohort. Another cohort member will then be invited to respond to the speaker before we move into an open question session. If you're in the Zoom call, please either raise your hand or put your name in the chat bar so we can see that you'd like to speak. If you're attending via our YouTube channel, please put your question in the chat bar and we will make it visible to the chair and the speaker so they can respond. If your question can't be answered during the session, we'll pass it on to the speaker anyway, so they're aware of the point you wanted to make. Please note that we're recording this event, and we're also following UCL's Code of Conduct about respect for equality, diversity, and inclusion for our discussion. Please can you also ensure that you have your mics on mute unless you are speaking, and when screens are shared, please turn off your videos. Global, digital. I shall start that bit again. Global, digital, capitalism. They're three very big words, and until recently, their dominant status in all aspects of our lives seemed to be fixed. It may seem strange in this context to cite the great soul singer, Sam Cooke, particularly since he admitted in his song Wonderful World that he didn't know much about history. But in his greatest song, he prophesied that a change is going to come. I hope tonight's speakers will help us think about how that change might come about. Our first speaker is Iray Çayli. Iray studies the spatial and visual politics of violence in Turkey and beyond. He's a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at LSE, where he also teaches at postgraduate level. He has guest edited special issues of the International Journal of Islamic Architecture and the Journal of Visual Culture, and co-edited Architecture of Emergency in Turkey, Heritage, Displacement and Catastrophe, which is to be published in 2021. Iray's first monograph is Victims of Commemoration, the Architecture and Violence of Confronting the Past in Turkey, forthcoming next year from Syracuse University Press. Iray's PhD was from UCL, so he's particularly welcome back here tonight. The title of his talk is Racialized Make Work and Let by Capitalism, Working from Home and Living or Dying from Work. I'll hand over to him now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that generous introduction and for inviting me. And thanks as well to Peg for the invitation. And many congratulations to Ken and to the rest of the cohort for organizing this wonderful symposium. One reason why I felt so fortunate to receive this invitation is because your pandemic-inflected themes of homework and the theme of the session, Globalized Digital Capitalism, have been so stimulating for me. My research, as you said, Paul, is broadly on the spatial and visual politics of violence. And my current project is on how these politics permeate discourses and practices around ecology and climate change, which are obviously related to the pandemic. My methods tend to be fieldwork based. And I did complete the year-long fieldwork for my current project in late 2019 in a pre-pandemic world, I guess. So while I haven't done any empirical research on the pandemic itself, when I received your invitation, I'd already been sort of accumulating notes about how the fallout from the pandemic is not happening in a vacuum, but is very much entangled in longer standing and often quite violent disparities. And I've been asking myself how we as spatial thinkers might wish to approach the pandemic as such. So that's what I'll kind of share with you this evening, a bunch of admittedly scattered notes by a spatial thinker. I'm kind of responding to what you've called homework and globalized digital capitalism in the time of the pandemic. So I'll try to share my screen. Yep. So now the pandemic has obviously already triggered much debate relevant to the theme of homework and globalized digital capitalism. This debate, I think we could say, has so far revolved around two foci, one being empirical, the other one being theoretical. The empirical focus has been on the fallout from the way governments have or have not restricted movement and gatherings, as epitomized in this MA cohort by Josephine Waugh's insightful work. And the theoretical focus has been, I think, on biopolitics through its well-known Foucauldian formulation, but also through its critical reformulations, such as Achille Mbembe's necropolitics. Famous European thinkers like Bruno Latour and Giorgio Agamben have been quick to opine that their respective governments' responses to the pandemic turned the entire citizenry into quintessential figures of biopolitics. To recall Foucault's classic formulation, whereas prior to the late 18th century, sovereignty meant the power to kill and let live, from that point onwards, a new and different power emerged. That was born then, and that kind of consisted in making live and letting die, which he also refers to as biopower. Those challenging this emphasis on biopolitics have drawn on necropolitics as developed by Achille Mbembe, for whom sovereign power and biopower have not only continued in modern times to operate in tandem, but have been also distributed unevenly across the world, where this unevenness has had a racialized character. Simply, some people have always continued to suffer from a kill and make live policy, even as others have become subjected to make live and let die. Now, arguing this point particularly perceptively in his Art Forum essay last summer, Paul Preciado wrote that the pandemic has only expanded the necropolitics that the West or the global North has long inflicted on the rest. Just consider Europe's violent border politics, says Preciado, and I quote, "Lesbos now starts at your doorstep, Calais blows up in your face, the new frontier is the mask, your epidermis, the new Lampedusa is your skin." Now, I believe such arguments as Preciado's are indispensable for situating the pandemic in longer and ongoing histories of violence that have had a racialized character and that entangle colonialism, capitalism, nation-state building, and post-national globalization in one another. But I also doubt whether necropolitics and biopolitics lend themselves to as neat a spatialization and teleology as Preciado implies. By spatialization, I mean the idea that a certain political force, be it necropolitics or biopolitics, can be essentialized as singularly dominating a given territory. By teleology, I mean the idea that something like the pandemic is effectively the West's experiencing what the world's marginalized have long experienced, or in other words, simply a case of necropolitics gradually sort of taking over from biopolitics as the power that controls Western lives. So this evening, I'd like us to reconsider these methodological problems of teleology and spatial essentialism as we approach our pandemic-inflicted themes, homework and globalized digital capitalism. Now, there are not only theoretical concerns at play here, but also potentially empirical reasons for reconsidering these methodological problems. Take the case of Leicester here in the UK, the city that emerged last summer as a major COVID-19 hotspot, despite months of nationwide lockdown that did help curb the virus's spread elsewhere. In late July, as restrictions were eased in much of the country, a new localized lockdown was declared for Leicester, alongside a few other cities in northern England. Health Secretary Matt Hancock tweeted the measure on July 30th. At the start of Eid al-Adha, one of the two major holidays Muslims observe, Hancock's tweet, moreover, did not just announce the measure, but also speculated about the root cause of the spread, suggesting that it was, and I quote, largely due to households meeting and not abiding to social distancing. Now, given that the city of Leicester and others placed under this new localized lockdown host some of the UK's largest Muslim populations, and that the measure was announced just hours before a major Islamic holiday, Hancock's tweet was interpreted as associating the virus's spread with Muslims and was followed by a flurry of commentary on particularly far-right social media that blamed the scale of the pandemic in the UK on its Muslim population. The reasons that made Leicester such a hotspot were, of course, different. One such reason, as a Guardian report earlier on in the summer had revealed, concerns the city's garment industry that supplies mainly to fast fashion companies. Now, this is a microeconomy formed in recent years, comprising cramped sweatshops and crumbling buildings where an illegally underpaid workforce makes about £3 to £4.5 an hour. During much of the spring lockdown, this already unscrupulous business not only continued unabated, but also expanded, with workers virtually locked indoors, even as workshops displayed closed signs. Both Leicester's highest number of cases at the time and its garment industry are in the city's east, where people of color and members of religious minorities are among some of the highest in the UK, and the garment workforce comprises a similar demographic. In the Leicester of last summer, then, the racialization that already characterized the pandemic on a material level was being doubled on a symbolic level by accusations targeting Muslims for its spread. Meanwhile, the fast fashion retailer Boohoo, whose suppliers comprise much of Leicester's garment district, recorded almost 50% year-on-year revenue growth last spring and summer, thanks to what the industry praised as the flexibility that enabled the company's rapid response to COVID by reorienting its product line towards loungewear, and therefore appealing to those stuck at home. Here, I'd like to take seriously the kind of product that's at the center of this story and that traverses various spaces and scales. I think this sort of networked and multi-scalar traversing is something on which we spatial thinkers might want to focus our thinking, as exemplified in this cohort by Falak Vora's dissertation on Auroville, India. That such a networked and multi-scalar traversing is key to the biopolitics-oriented debate on COVID-19 is evident in Joshua Clover's recent critical response to the debate's fixation with Foucauldian biopower, or the power to make, live, and let die. Echoing those emphasizing the continuing importance of necropolitics, Clover argues that make, live, and let die is simply a tool among others in the long-standing socioeconomic order that has only intensified over the recent months. And he suggests that the power actually upholding this order hinges on a ratio of make work and let buy that puts people into work only on condition that they give what they make back to the capitalist economy. What needs grappling with then is not simply work from home, but rather the ways this ratio of make work and let buy is sustained through objects that traverse various spatialities. Fast fashion, loungewear, appealing to what you may call home workers is one example of such objects. Another, and potentially even more widely appealing one, is canned and frozen food that a Turkish company called Dardanel produces. Dardanel, similarly to Boohoo, recorded 96% year-on-year revenue growth during the pandemic. Alongside its phenomenal growth, two other reasons put the company in the spotlight over the past few months. First, in late July, as Dardanel's home city, the otherwise small and quiet town of Çanakkale in Turkey's northwest, became a coronavirus hotspot, several workers at one of the company's factories tested positive. The company followed by quarantining all its workforce on site, naming this strategy quarantine under surveillance and closed circuit work. Workers were asked to pack up and come to the factory to live and work there for 2 weeks. In defending the measure as a government-approved one, the company alluded to a recent project that a consortium of 3 ministries and a business people's association had launched a couple of months into the pandemic. This was a project that had initially been conceived about 7 years ago with a focus on building mid-sized industrial zones, but was now reoriented towards what the authorities called isolated manufacturing hubs, touted as a response to the pandemic and a step towards normalization by rendering manufacturing pandemic-proof. The idea is that these so-called isolated manufacturing hubs host workers and their families 24/7, and that they are pandemic-proof thanks to on-site testing facilities and even their own bespoke cemeteries. This, one could say, is a model of living from and dying at work rather than working from home. Now, the second time Dardanelles made headlines was just about 6 weeks ago, when half a dozen women's job applications there were allegedly rejected on grounds of their being members of Turkey's Roma population. The Roma are among those hardest hit by the pandemic in Turkey, due not only to the deep poverty that has long affected many of them, but also to the sorts of work that they have taken up in cities over the past few decades, such as collecting and sorting out rubbish for recycling in a country that until recently had yet to institutionalize recycling. If anything, many in such line of work have recently become obliged to travel even longer distances to collect rubbish due to the wave of urban renewal projects that have expelled them from their centrally located neighborhoods to so-called affordable housing built for them on the urban periphery, albeit with little or no concern for how this would impact their work, how this displacement would impact their work. So recalling Anna Alexandra Seres's dissertation from, again, this cohort on mid-20th century Budapest's lottery houses, this rehousing of Turkey's urban underclass overlooked work's significance to dwelling and was particularly detrimental to the livelihood of parts of the Roma population, as they now had to cover ever longer distances to city centers for their daily bread. They have had to continue doing so, of course, throughout the pandemic, too, having fallen through the cracks of the little government support that's been there. The obligation to continue to pound the streets for work has exposed the Roma to not only the pandemic, but also stigmatization as an unhygienic and reckless people whose very bodies are supposedly virus hotspots. Hence, the kind of racist rejection of the applicants at Dardanelles, at their factory, whose being Roma sort of became a pretext for unemployability under the current conditions. Leicester and Çanakkale paint a particularly sinister picture of a potential post-pandemic world where a racialized workforce locked up in factories or pounding the streets worked to death, manufacturing the goods that those made to work from home indulge in browsing through and buying. And this is a world where these two constituencies, these two groups often live side by side in the same geography. But to echo someone like Peg and echo her pioneering work on affirmative engagements, you could say progressive engagements with biopolitics, the past few months have also thrown up networks of care and solidarity that attempt to forge a different link between those working from home and those living or dying from work. I'd like to conclude by briefly mentioning one such network from, again, Turkey, whose work is particularly pertinent to the Roma population. This is an initiative called Transform from Home, founded by volunteers of the Deep Poverty Network, who, as evident in their emphasis from home, consist largely of the kind of home workers that feature prominently in biopolitics-oriented analyses of the pandemic. The initiative has used home 3D printers to produce masks and distributed these to Roma populations in, for instance, Istanbul, who have to be out and about on the streets to make a living, but cannot afford protective equipment and so remain highly vulnerable to the virus. Alongside these masks, they've also distributed TV sets and tablets that have become important due to a distance learning platform that Turkey's Ministry of Education has hastily developed in response to the pandemic. While the government touted the platform as evidence of the country's leadership in information technologies, its assumption that everyone has the same level of access to the necessary infrastructure was soon thrown into disarray. The various tragedies that resulted from this assumption are too numerous to mention here, but suffice it to say that children have even died falling from heights whilst looking for a good signal. Now, the transformed from home volunteers not only provide what we may term pandemic infrastructure, such as masks and tablets, but also conduct a public discourse to clarify the politics of their initiative. Through press statements and interviews, they stress that their work is driven not by charity or generosity, but rather by a political objective, to show that the government is failing its most basic duty of providing the tools its most underprivileged populations need in order to survive the pandemic. That these tools are in fact so easily providable as by a network of middle-class volunteers, and that the authorities must therefore live up to their responsibility by righting this wrong. So I think I'll leave it there on that note about intervening into the uneven spatial distribution of the pandemic's effects through politically motivated solidarity and care, rather than sort of giving in to the inevitability that characterizes teleological progression and spatial essentialism. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to your questions and comments.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Irai, for a very lively and engaged talk. I'd like to call Abdul Rahman El Taliawi from the cohort to make the first response to what you said.
Yes, hi. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Thank you, Irai, for this thoughtful and insightful talk. I particularly enjoyed your allusion in the beginning to the notion that bodies as territories have themselves become subjects to direct subjects of biopolitics and necropolitics, and with it clothing and dressing code, as you had also mentioned, fashion. And it is definitely something that we have witnessed in the time that we spent under lockdown, the unevenness and the disparities in the conditions of how we all in the end were subjected to the pandemic, but in different, widely different conditions. And I think your talk also reminded me of David Harvey's reflections on the geographical imagination of space-time, and how he has discussed that time is a historical and social construct, and it changes over time and with different societies. And I think that this is our perception of time is something that we have experienced, that it is changing, and that it has changed in isolation and under lockdown. And it is exactly what David Harvey was discussing, that the fact that it is tied to production and capitalist modes of labor. And my question regards this issue also points to the mayor and the tweet in Leicester that you had showed. And a lot of, sometimes the discussion between us always tends to go to, is this an individual problem that the mayor has? Is this a structural issue? And how much of a spatial issue it inevitably and necessarily is. And I wish you could tell us a bit on to differentiate between how we can see this issue as not only an individual issue, but more of a structural and global issue, and how it is necessarily spatial, if so. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful comment and question. Yeah, although again, these are kind of very provisional thoughts, what your question kind of raised is precisely what I'm trying to grapple with, and that's why I kind of try and unpack how these, it's not a coincidence, definitely not, that these two cities of, Leicester and Çanakkale are actually host to these factories that are working under these kind of completely unsafe conditions at this time, right? So what Matt Hancock, the health secretary, kind of tweeted is just one, or the kind of commentary that kind of prompted afterwards on particularly social media is one type of response to the kind of spread of the virus there. But exactly like you're saying, this is just a symptom. It's not definitely not the problem. The problem is that there's that kind of structural disparity at work in these two places. And in many others, these just happen to be ones where, that I'm kind of more familiar with, Turkey being where I do research and the UK being where I live. But definitely that is why I think space is so key. These kind of, not just space, but also, again, these materialities that traverse different spaces. And it's not a coincidence that these two objects that are at the center of these stories are the kind of things that are geared towards, you could say, us home workers, right? Frozen food, canned food, fast fashion, loungewear, right? So, and I think that is really where we, that's something that helps us get a grasp on exactly the structural problem that you're alluding to.
Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions in the room for Irai? Let me ask one of my own then, to abuse the privilege of the chair. It's interesting the way that this pandemic is both concentrating things and sort of driving things together and driving things apart simultaneously. In some aspects of our lives, we're becoming completely atomized. In other aspects, there are new social solidarities that are emerging. I just wondered if you can see any sort of long-term things that come from that, or is this just a passing phenomenon that will work itself through and disappear?
Again, great question. And sometimes it's difficult to trace the continuity of these movements because they don't operate the way companies do. They don't have a brand name. I mean, they do come up with these names like transform from home, right, etc. But due to various reasons, they might kind of at some point dissolve and morph into something else as a movement, etc. So, but yes, I mean, I would say there are definitely continuities, although you don't have the same name of an initiative or things like that. Because I do know that the people who are involved in many of them, continue, even though, say, in 2 years' time, these particular initiatives kind of are no longer with us. They still, obviously carry on this work in different ways. And for instance, to make this more concrete, the Deep Poverty Network is led by a woman who was already campaigning in the 2000s against evictions of the Roma population. So against the kind of expulsions that resulted from the kind of so-called urban transformation that displaced particularly the Roma population in Istanbul. So you clearly see that link there. Yeah, but definitely, it's an important question.
Thank you. I think Mina has a question, so if I could ask you to come in, please.
Hi, thank you. That was a very, very interesting talk. I didn't know about the Dardanelles live-in factory arrangements, and that made me think about the recent earthquake happened in Izmir and about disasters in general. Do you think these pandemic arrangements would be exemplary to create, for example, earthquake-proof factory settlements and maybe create another version of gated communities where workers are under surveillance all the time? Because although it sounds well-intentioned at the beginning, it's a bit problematic.
Thanks so much for that great question. I mean, again, this is, I always, the way I look at these things is, like I said in the last bit of the talk, echoing the work of, Peg. I'd like to see this kind of issue as up for grabs, as it were. You know, it's up to us and up to the movements to make something better out of these crises. I don't think there's only one way that they can go. But what I'm particularly interested in, or troubled by, you could say, is exactly the kind of issue that you faced around the so-called isolated manufacturing hubs that you also mentioned in your question, where they don't even need to materialize in their own right. But once you have this architectural idea out there, and the pictures the images that I showed were from their official kind of documentation that they put out online. It's the kind of architectural imaginary that you had there then became reason to legitimize certain practices at factories like Dardanelles without having the kind of bespoke architecture for it. That was just a factory. That wasn't a kind of factory designed bespoke for isolation, but it was turned into one, right? And that was legitimized in a way, in an indirect way, by the architectural kind of renderings and ideas that were put out there for that project. So again, I mean, it might happen, it might not happen. It's up to the kind of social movements that will work against it, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. We've got a question from the YouTube audience, so we'll make this the last one. It's from Anal Mehta. He says, "Hi, thank you so much for this thought-provoking presentation, Irai. My question is, do you think there's a class-based divide rather than more than a racial divide which the pandemic brings out?" So could you comment on that, please?
For sure. And I don't see these two things as mutually exclusive. In the examples that I discussed, they often overlap, intersect. Obviously, it depends where you're looking at this. But there's also a gendered aspect, which I didn't have the time to go into, because many of the workers that work at Dardanelles are actually women. And they basically, the company released on March the 8th, which is celebrated as Women's Day in Turkey. They released this video saying, this is our workforce. It's predominantly consisting of women, and we're all for women and employing women, etc. It was just a kind of PR kind of project. But then it turned out, of course, these are the very women that are put in these kind of conditions of having to be locked in with the virus going around, etc. So you there immediately see how that's kind of praise for diversity becomes suddenly very much to the disadvantage of the very kind of constituency that's supposed to be kind of included in this policy of diversity. So yeah, class, race, racism, I should say, and gender obviously intersect in these places.
Well, thank you so much, Irai, for kicking off our symposium so interestingly and thoughtfully. Our next speaker is Dr. Karen Burns. Because of the time difference between the UK and Australia, her talk was pre-recorded on Wednesday. Here's Josephine Waugh from the cohort to introduce her. I hope.
Hello, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Karen Burns. Karen is an architectural historian and theorist located in Melbourne, Australia. She researches histories of women's rights in architecture and histories of 19th century design, including domesticity and settler colonialism. With Laurie Brown, she is co-editor of the Bloomsbury Global History of Women in Architecture, 1960 to 2015. Thank you, Karen, for being with us today. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you all for being here. Wominjeka, welcome. I want to begin by acknowledging that this presentation has been written and is being delivered on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, who are a clan of the Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge and offer respect to Wurundjeri ancestors and elders and acknowledge that their land was never ceded. Thank you for your kind invitation to participate in the Homework Symposium. In particular, I want to thank Paul Steeples and Peg Rawes for their invitation and their organising. Now, somewhere along the way, I discovered that I was grouped in a session with the terrifying name of Globalised Digital Capitalism, which are three very large abstract nouns. I'm going to kind of step away from them and sort of sidle up to them in a more insidious way. I'm going to modify them by adding the word everyday to the front, everyday global digital capitalism. But I'm going to proceed with the everyday for quite a while. As Rita Felsky in her 1998 essay in New Formations observed, the everyday is a way of experiencing the world. She was trying to step away from the traditional alignment of the everyday with the routine and the habitual and the ordinary, terms which often had a negative connotation. I don't think they do, but we'll come to that a bit later. The everyday is important. It allows me to think about the specific concrete conditions of knowledge production, and the everyday is the terrain on which a large part of my politics is practiced. The everyday undergirds two projects I'm going to address in this presentation. The Bloomsbury Global Encyclopedia of Architecture with my colleague Laurie Brown, and digital feminist architectural activism and advocacy as exemplified by one group, Parla, of which I was a founding member. The knowledge and the subjectivity of the architectural historian is grounded in their everyday, the specific concrete conditions of production. This is not to assert an essentialist subject who can only write about their own experience, but instead to think about the way that the everyday is a frame of knowledge practices and that it offers us all a way to reflect on our own subjectivity as architectural knowledge producers. These components of the self are multiple. I have been for a long time a minority subject in architectural academia. In 1995, when I came to the Desiring Practices Conference in London, women comprised only 6% of academics in Australian architecture schools. Then on the other hand, I am a white woman living in a settler colonial society. There are different knowledges and subject positions that we are called on to perform in our daily work, which also add various components to this subjectivity. In Gayatri Spivak's 1993 book, Outside in the Teaching Machine, she declared that one's history practice and one's teaching practice should interrupt each other. The two practices are frequently siloed, but switching between the two, the one demands different questions of the other. We are in a historical moment where, crucially, university students are making very important demands on curricula in the classroom space. How do these rightful demands interrupt history practice? What is it to think about teaching architectural history in the classroom as a situated practice? To reference Donna Haraway's 1988 Situated Knowledges essay, in which she addresses the positionality of knowledge. Situated practice is also a term used by education specialists who expose and challenge the monolinguistic classroom. A situated practice values the experience and knowledge each student brings to the classroom and builds on these experiences to make real-life connections. It sounds to me that, fortunately, the Masters of Architectural History URI can do this for you. The architectural canon is monolinguistic. It is produced in metropolitan centres in the global north, most frequently in English, and it is the history of the 0.01% with particular subjects overrepresented in this history. Even an expansion into the global landscape of UNESCO-listed world monuments does not necessarily address the values and experiences each student brings to the classroom. I wonder, how do architectural students see themselves in this canonical curriculum? Where can they see something that speaks to their experiences or find materials for assembling a roadmap of where they can go? The architectural history curriculum can be a mechanism that immobilises students from seeing themselves as agents in and of history. The Global Encyclopedia project that I'm working on inscribes the life histories of several thousand women at the end of the 20th century. It shifts the historical narrative from the canon to architectural practice in the everyday, whether that's the design of buildings, designing policy, writing journalism, or teaching. I hope it will be politically transformative to sketch out different blueprints for an everyday life in architecture, one that provides opportunities for leadership and organising and making change. Through a Twitter feed, UK-based architectural historian Elizabeth Darling recommended a piece in The Guardian that she gives to her students that I think speaks to this issue of the everyday, of showcasing an everyday practice in architecture. In this Guardian essay, Judy Richardson, who participated in the civil rights lunch counter protests, you can see her here in the middle of the photograph. She offers this observation, and I don't think she's being disrespectful, but she's making a really important point about the way that history is written. The dangers of focusing on the heroics of individuals in the civil rights movement, such as Dr. King, as I think it's more important to focus on ordinary folk. If you believe it's only amazing people who are doing great things, you don't realise you can do it too. It immobilises you. Then they've got you. We hold frequent symposia in architectural history on the archive as the site of our practice, but we focus far less frequently on the classroom as a key scene of subject production. I hope that this question of a history of the everyday that can speak to the values of students, and I teach in very multicultural classrooms in Australia, is evident and will be made visible by the project that I'm working on with Laurie, the Bloomsbury Global Encyclopedia, which I think can be described as an atlas of experiences. Feminism pioneered the writing of a history of experiences, of histories that can do justice to radically different social experiences, which is why life writing and the everyday are key terms for feminism. This kind of history deals not only with the social construction of subjectivity, but with social experiences that are often not registered in the historical record or pushed to its margins. What are the experiences of several thousand women who trained originally in architecture in the later part of the 20th century? What is an everyday life in architecture? What kinds of things can one do with an architecture degree? And there are 9 areas in the encyclopedia. These are the area editors listed here. We have 1,150 entries. I haven't read them yet. We start reading in 2 weeks. They are predominantly biographical, but they are also accompanied by thematic essays that highlight key topics in particular geographies. These also allow for many more women to be included. Thematic entries are decided by area editors, often in conjunction with regional reference groups. So, for example, in the Oceania section where I'm writing some essays, there's a thematic essay on land rights and another one on colonialism/post-colonialism to explain the significance of these ideas and histories for a global readership. As well, the area editor writes a 5,000-word introduction to each section, outlining the social and geopolitical context of production. Books on women in architecture are easily sold as celebratory projects. There's a whole new market out there, and they do that, but there's a lot more going on beyond the liberal feminist project of correcting the record by adding more women in. This encyclopedia follows the recent turn in feminist scholarship outside architecture, which has moved from a celebratory approach to one that digs in to the unevenness of the alliances and different ideas of what the political goals of women's liberation might be. It maps the multiple differences of lived experiences in women's rights movements, differences that are magnified in a global knowledge project. Part of the knowledge that is generated is a question of often taken for granted terms like architecture or feminism. Here's a list of our many countries to be included. I can come back to that if you want. Increasingly now, I see feminism as a term in quotation marks or under erasure, to retrieve an idea from my post-structuralist youth. Objections to the word feminist are not unusual in the women's movement. In some places in the world, it's a dangerous word to use. In others, it's synonymous with Western imperialism. It has been a particular point of debate in the Black women's movement. In Australia, for example, in 1976, Pat O'Shane from the Kunjunji clan of the Kuku-Ulunji people argued that the Australian women's movement was a white feminist movement. Some years later, in 1994, Bunjalung woman and writer Melissa Lukashenko addressed white Australian feminists and observed that they have little or no understanding of their colonial presence. Many of you may not know, but 20th century Australia was a racialised welfare state. Some people argue it still is, in which white women were the beneficiaries and sometimes the agents of the state involved in removing Aboriginal children from their families, a history known as the stolen generations. So a global knowledge project places the lens of gender under the lens, even as we use gender as an analytic frame to survey a particular period in which women in architecture were frequently marked as gendered subjects, a period marked by intense struggles over systems of gender norms, a period in which architecture and the social context of architecture production were organised around gender norms, and investigates how these norms were constructed and lived out with degrees of agency and oppression in the everyday. A number of theorists, for example, the art theorist and queer activist Craig Owens, more recently North American Black feminist Brittany Cooper, have warned of the dangers of collapsing or assimilating the category women into a larger category of all marginalised and oppressed groups. Through these moves, the specificity of the feminist critique of patriarchy is denied, observe Owens, in the discourse of others. I think Lola Olufemi, in her new book, Feminism Interrupted, describes this well when she describes the struggle for gendered liberation as a struggle for justice, one that can transform the world for everyone. So this global knowledge project has multiple aims. It puts the terms and chronologies of architecture and feminism in the canon into question. It builds a portrait of the extraordinary ordinary lives in architecture, and it produces a relational geography in which the global and the local are knitted together. The entangled relationships of metropole and colony are well communicated in Anuradha Siddiqui's entry on Sri Lankan architect Minette de Silva. There's only an excerpt here. I apologise to you and Anuradha. There's not enough room to show the whole brilliantly written biographical entry. But what we see here is the importance of key elements in de Silva's early years and training. By 1900, the British Arts and Crafts Project was inscribed with racialised ideologies, but its nativist impulses also provided a framework for thinking about the nation to come. De Silva's early years of her everyday life, of her practice and training, were structured by the struggles for independence, and the decolonisation settlement of Britain propelled her to further training in the metropole at the AA School of Architecture. This global knowledge project is one of a number of feminist advocacy projects that are made possible by new digital technologies. Here's one of our Google Doc spreadsheets. The project is only possible because of the everyday ubiquity of email and shared Google spreadsheets, and now Zoom. Originally, the project began with regional reference groups to generate recommended names and topics for inclusion, and we now have 350 writers. The possibilities that digital life made for 21st century feminist organising were revealed in early projects like Tarana Burke's Me Too project. In their wake, numerous feminist architectural projects have worked to shape a counter-public sphere, a place of advocacy and action that can call out architecture's monoculture. Here is Feminist Wall, which calls out events with male-only panels. Another really great website, India in Architecture, which showcased a woman architect for every day of 365 days of the year. These digital platforms can also transmit information usually locked inside the workplace and opaque to public culture, as Parla did in communicating the experiences of women at work from their 2012 survey. And they put up the quotations as women talked about their experiences in the workplace. Or sexual harassment can be recorded in the Google Doc Shitty Architectural Men. I also recommend ArchiLeaks, which has been taken down, where people who worked in high-profile Canon architectural firms spilled the beans on their labour experiences. Blogs, Twitter, websites, and particularly Twitter, which reacts in real time to events, are good at auditing gender balance on panels, lecture series, books. They're good at exposing what institutions keep private. I've been following the letters of request students have sent on Black Lives Matter to university administrators in North America. Social media channels provide modes of action. A global digital public sphere provides larger audiences and momentum and effective geography of politics and emotion and action. Okay, so I've addressed the global and the digital. So in my final few minutes, as I rush through the last part of the 20th century in 15 minutes, I'm going to turn to the big C, capitalism. Not really in a side kind of glance. Feminism is a transfigurative politics. It produces critique, but it also asks what other life worlds are possible or have been possible. I'm very influenced now by the work of an Australian economic theorist, J.K. Gibson, and their work, Capitalist Politics of 2006, which built on a longer trajectory of their work, which dislodges the discursive dominance of capitalist economic activity and reclaims it as a contested space of representation. In 1993, in a great piece where they talk about smashing capitalism in their spare time at their kitchen tables, they reasoned that their feminism was a politics that could be enacted in the everyday, and why shouldn't their anti-capitalism being conducted in the everyday as well? And they asked, what practices of thinking and feeling, what dispositions and attitudes can we cultivate to displace the familiar mode of being of the anti-capitalist subject with its negative and stymied positioning? If we are to enact new economies, we need to imagine the economy differently, as something that is created in specific geographical contexts. They have continued their work on mapping the diverse economies that exist outside the focus on the 60% capitalist economy, looking at things like co-ops, social enterprise, small businesses, state-funded work, etc. This is a good question. How can we move beyond this critique of negativity and stymied positioning? What other life worlds and economies have architects inhabited? A glimpse of some of these alternatives is provided for me in the work of Diana Lee Smith, director with Devinder Lampa of Mazingira, a Nairobi-based research and development NGO. Diana's worked with policy formation at the UN on women's property rights in Africa. She's been co-designer with Devinder of a monument to honour the survivors of colonial atrocity, the Mau Mau. And she's currently working on an urban food plan for Nairobi. She is of the same generation as Bernard Shumi and Rem Koolhaas and trained at the AA as well. Imagine a different history if we put her in the canon. How do we inscribe architecture's other life worlds, its diverse economies in the books and curricula that structure the classroom and structure the identity conditions of the subjects, students and staff who labour within? In their literary study, Deep Histories, Gender and Colonialism in Southern Africa of 2002, the editors argue that scholars should pay attention to cycles of silencing and voicing. Deep Histories asks, if a voice speaks, who will listen? Speaking relies, they observe, on the present and engagement of the listener. The discipline of architectural history has produced work on gender and the everyday and race since the late 1970s, at least. But inscribing the lives of diverse and everyday architectural practitioners into the centre of the discipline of the history has been a much slower process and arguably not yet successful. I'm hoping that the encyclopedia will help us ask about how we shift our history curricula from a monument-centred approach to one that teaches the history of multiple practices, including building, that will help us contextualise the canon, to think about the production and communication of architectural history within certain everyday determinants, such as the classroom and the experiences of staff and students, and to think about architectural labour and skill, because I think the everyday is such an important place. It's where we exercise and practice our skills as designers or policymakers or writers or historians, and it's a place of incredible richness, and it also grounds us in the material conditions of our everyday lives and our subjectivity and the agency and oppressions that different subject groups experience inside architecture and out there in the world. All right, I'm done.
Thank you, Karen. I'm now going to pass the mic to Falak, who's going to be asking our first question.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was indeed very insightful. Being an architect myself, it was more relative. Like I could actually see myself as a subject here. Having been in the practice for a year at least, so I could associate to most of the things that you said, being very new in the field, so most of them. I'd like to ask you, like with contextualizing the situation in the industry with the current scenario of the pandemic, with the idea of the everyday space being changed and limited to just the domestic homes, because everybody is inside their homes and they're working from homes, working remotely. So the lines between the professional lives and the domestic lives have blurred more, which was anyway the case with practicing architects. How would you like to expand more on that? Like how does that change, according to you, how does that change the situation of practicing architects, female architects, if that's the word?
Well, I think it's an acknowledged fact, although the remedies haven't necessarily been directed towards it, that the effects of COVID-19 have been disproportionately gendered and also classed and raced. So I would want to, the feminism that I hope I support is intersectional. So there are different fallouts, but for women, I mean, our encyclopedia project is now delayed by a year because all of us have been struggling with carrying 3 workloads. Our everyday jobs haven't slowed down. Many of us who have children have been supervising home schooling or remote learning, as it's called. I think that happened in the UK as well. And we're also supervising children at home, and then there's an enormous labour around food and shopping because you have to mask up to go out. When I bring the shopping home, it all has to be washed before it's put away. And I've also been trying to look after an elderly friend, and I think a lot of women have also had to take on that burden of caring for senior people as well who've needed to shelter at home. I mean, on the positive side, one would hope that it would accelerate the shift to home learning, because architecture offices have been very much focused on a presenteeism agenda where they insist that people are physically in the office and that they work long hours. One would hope that it has demonstrated to many practices that flexible home learning is a viable mode of working in the architecture office. But what I also know is that it's allowed for increased surveillance of staff. And there was a terrible piece in The Guardian about 2 weeks ago by Oliver Wainwright on a number of labour cases in British architectural practices that are going to court, where staff were asked to work 15 hours a day. And I also know in some university contexts, universities have been using digital surveillance technology that surveils students, which is incredibly intrusive and has produced enormous distress as well. So at the moment, it's mixed. I think we're in a moment of amazing change and crisis, which is what often happens in a wartime situation. But at the moment, we don't know, how many of those scenarios will fall out to be positive things. I think the big thing for architectural practices, I've got a friend who's a business consultant, and she says that architectural practices haven't developed ways of relating to their staff where they trust their staff. They're used to having them all in a huge room where they can be physically surveyed. And for them, it's they have to move into a different staff-employer relationship of trust. I always say you can pretty quickly tell when people are not really getting their work done. It's evident in the results, which is why it has to be results-based vision of people's work rather than regulating how many times they spend, how many hours they spend at a desk. So I think there are multiple effects, but it's particularly gendered, but we also know it's classed and raced as well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Karen. Before our next question, would you mind turning off your split share screen?
Sorry. All right, I've got to work out how to get out of it. Stop share would be the thing. Sorry. I haven't done screen share before. Can you hear me?
Great, thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I can hear you. So I personally have a question for you. So I find it super interesting, sort of looking at these biases and sort of these contextual realities and how they exist already in the workplace within architecture. And I'm curious how you think we will begin to write and record histories of gender and other kinds of bias when our professional lives are increasingly digitalized. Do you think that this will require a new sort of type of attention to biases within this context, or demand sort of the new writings and research of historiography?
I don't feel very hopeful at the moment. I think all of these digital platforms have provided a way for people who are not in charge of the mainstream media in architecture or the mainstream media generally to share information and to produce a kind of counter public sphere. I think the impact that can have on the mainstream and the conditions of power is a whole other question. As I said in the presentation, historians have been writing histories of architecture that are centered around gender or the everyday or race since the late 1970s, but there's been a real resistance to inscribing them at the center of the discipline. I mean, I hope that we're in a historical moment that the power of that counter public sphere can exert so much pressure. But I think it's a liberal fallacy that if you present people with the right kind of information, then the blinkers will fall off their eyes and they will see the light, because that liberal thinking doesn't take into account the way in which knowledge and power are so deeply ingrained.
Mm-hmm.
There's enormous investment in maintaining the status quo. You know, we have seen that unfold today in North America, and reasons for the investment in that status quo. So I think it's not just a question of digital technology, it's a question about the fundamental relationship between knowledge and power. Well, for me, yeah. We can exert pressure, but how much that forces change. Maybe in 3 days' time, when they've counted the rest of the postal votes, I'll feel more positive.
Right, so do we have any other questions from the audience that we can direct to
I have a question.
Thanks, Ken.
Sure. Well, thank you for the lecture, first of all. And I really focused on one quote that you put in the presentation by Julie Richardson. And it mentioned how there should be a focus on ordinary folk instead of the extraordinary. And what I wanted to know is that with the current situation now with COVID and how it has difficulted the access that we have to archives, for example, physical archives, I wanted to know if this situation showcases how maybe online archives focus or showcase mostly canon or extraordinary histories instead of the everyday. I wanted to know if you could expand that.
I think archives generally do. Well, it depends where you're looking. I mean, the major architectural archives are the CCA in Canada, for example. Women and other minority subjects in architecture tend to have very fragmentary presence in the archives. And then there's a whole other world of the archives beyond the English-speaking world. And I think that's the point about the Encyclopedia Project, that so much architectural history is written in English and focuses on the global north, on the US and the UK and Western Europe. And my students have been experiencing this issue as well while they've been undertaking research essays, that the online space is dominated by known canonical material. I think that's a really good point, that maybe our attempts to construct another history are founded on other methods. And the method that's really been working for me, because I've been writing some entries for the Australian section of the encyclopedia, I've been relying on oral history and emails as a sort of printed form of oral history. So one of the reasons we wanted the encyclopedia to cover the period 1960 to 2015 was to capture oral history knowledge of that older generation before they pass away. And I found that interviewing people, but also emailing people and asking them for tips or asking them about their own experiences, people have been really generous. But obviously it depends what period you're working on. It works reasonably well if you're working on the present day, or I've been looking at the 1960s onwards and people are still alive. So, but oral history is a really important method for capturing the experiences of people who are often marginalised in the architectural record. And those are the kind of techniques we need to reclaim. Like, I think oral history and biography have become a bit contaminated in architecture because they're so available to be appropriated by PR machines, but in fact they're primary methods for writing history from below, certainly in other disciplines, and life history is really important. Writing the experiences of people's everyday.
Thank you, Karen, for speaking with us today and for being here.
Well, I'm sure there were lots of questions you would have liked to have been able to ask Karen, but you can't because she's safely asleep, probably on the other side of the world. So could I ask Malcolm to introduce the next segment of the evening? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, all. I'm here to introduce Reinhold Martin, who is a professor of architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, where he directs the Temple Horn Buell Center of the Study of American Architecture and is a member of the Center for Comparative Media. He is also a founding co-editor of the important journal Grey Room, which brings together scholarly and theoretical articles from the fields of architecture, art, media, and politics. Professor Martin's books include Organizational Complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space, published in 2003, Utopia's Ghosts, Architecture and Postmodernism, again, published in 2010, and The Urban Apparatus, Media, Politics, and the City, published in 2016. His forthcoming book is Knowledge Worlds, Media, Materiality, and the Making of the Modern University, being published by the Columbia University Press, scheduled for release in 2021. His lecture today is entitled, What's Next? Professor Reinhold Martin, welcome. I hand the screen and the stage over to you.
Okay, well, great. Well, first of all, thanks so much, and thanks for hanging in. I'll try to be pretty brief so that we can have more of a back and forth, a Q&A. But I really want to begin, with a word of thanks to Paul, Peg, and their colleagues in the MA program and at UCL for inviting me to join this quite timely discussion, and to Array and to Karen at a distance for so much already to think about. And I think, there's a lot to talk about in a way that we can try to synthesize. It's always, I have to say, a particular honor to be invited to respond to the thoughts of students and to engage in the kind of dialogue with students' work. So in particular, I want to thank Malcolm and Vid for chairing and responding to the panel, and also to thank Anna, Dhruv, Falak, and Josephine for sending the abstracts of their fascinating MA theses. So again, afterwards, maybe if we could talk more about the nuts and bolts of architectural scholarship in your work. So I'd love to hear more. So it's in this spirit, though. I just want to, begin by dedicating my own all too brief remarks here to a former teacher and dear friend of mine, Mark Cousins, who, as I think you probably know, passed away about a month ago in London. Among many other things, Mark was an astute political analyst. And I always used to love talking politics with Mark, first in the AA bar way back in the previous century, and in many places, on both sides of the Atlantic since. So in a kind of, in a kind of modest tribute, I've imagined my own brief remarks here as a sort of one-sided conversation, ideally over beer or something, with Mark about what has been happening this week in the United States and how that might bear on the broader themes, addressed by our on-screen gathering. It's really literally, that's the kind of stuff, we used to talk about. And I'm also sure that I suspect that some of you might have some questions about, how at least we on this side are interpreting events here at the moment. So I mentioned the timeliness of our discussion, to which I want to add the obvious, but still I think necessary caveat. It shouldn't be necessary, but I think it unfortunately can be that the United States is not the center of the world. I mean, American exceptionalism is alive and well, as you probably see on your screens if you check, as if what's happening here is the center of the world. No, it's because the US has the military, the missiles, and the money to make it seem this way, and is busy protecting that regardless of the outcome of the presidential election. And on that sort of front, I think in broad political, in terms of broad political trends, I do think that we can be heartened by many things. For example, by the resurgence of left progressive movements worldwide. We've already heard about some examples, both from Ire and from Karen. And the influence of which is visible, I think, at a different scale. For example, in the constitutional referendum that was just passed in Chile, which holds at least the possibility of reversing the effects of the economic policies installed there by the neoliberal Chicago boys, as they were known, following the violent CIA-assisted overthrow of the Allende government in 1973, September 11th, in fact. So historically, the red thread, so to speak, that connects the Chilean referendum with the US election is neoliberalism itself, which remains very much alive and well. So with this in mind, and relating specifically to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on our work as scholars, but also as political agents and actors in the world, I want to begin with the untimely question that I offered as the title of this talk: what's next? Well, okay. So first of all, just a quick. You probably know most of this, but just in case, and again with the caveat, this isn't everything that's going on in the world, but a brief update on the American situation. As we speak, it does look like Joe Biden has gained enough votes in the Electoral College, the arcane institution that manages to reproduce the sort of primary dispossession of settler colonialism. You can see it on the maps by redistributing political power upwards towards landed elites in the old days, and now towards their, in a sense, essentially literal and or social historical descendants. Nonetheless, Biden seems to, at this point, does look like he has gained enough electoral votes, which again, as I said, only unevenly reflects the much larger versions in the popular vote to have won the presidency. But yesterday, too, the U.S. recorded, this kind of happened overnight, depending on which reports you were looking at and how the judgments have been made, and when the votes have been made public. But yesterday, too, the U.S. recorded 120,000 new COVID cases, the highest number yet. They keep talking about this as like records, because this is how the mass media, processes things in terms of like record-breaking events. So like COVID cases, and this is somewhat more structural, the US counts its votes by state. So both of these sets of numbers, votes and cases, are counted by state, by the political units that make this country, the United States of America, a kind of a federated republic. And as, again, you may know, the electoral margins in several key states for Biden and in the other direction as well were razor thin. The much hyped blue, which means Democratic or basically center-left, mostly center wave, the blue wave did not materialize. The Democrats lost seats in the House of Representatives, which they still do control. And pending the results of two runoff elections that look like they're now going to happen in December, these are the two in Georgia, they failed to gain control of the Senate. So this was hardly the repudiation of the Trump project for which many had hoped. Now, in terms of neoliberal social and economic policy, the sort of legacies of the Chicago boys and their comrades, however we define this, and we can talk about this too, there are different ways to interpret the term neoliberal in policy terms as well as in cultural and social terms. This wasn't even a bump in the road. The picture, though, this picture of the, kind of career of neoliberalism in the US, at least, becomes a bit more complicated, I think. However, at the crucial state and municipal level, in a manner I think that some of you in the UK may recognize, and there's some parallels to Labour and so on. But so despite significant Republican gains both nationwide and locally, Democratic Socialist candidates gained unprecedented statewide office in districts around New York, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. These are mostly representatives elected to the state houses, to the State House of Representatives or the state senates, which are the popular bodies that govern the individual states, with the governor as the executive. So, and this again, if we do, it'd be interesting to compare, but this is pretty dramatic for the US. It is not dramatic for most of Europe or other parts of the world. But it is, I think it's important to know. And it's heartening, to be honest, and has a lot of, crisscrosses and crosshatches with a lot of what we're talking about here. So among the proposals that animated many of those local races has been the broad, ambitious climate program of the Green New Deal. There have been many other concerns as well, but one practical consequence then of the sort of mixed results at the national level is therefore the ongoing difficulty of getting through progressive justice and jobs-oriented climate legislation at any meaningful scale. So this is, you probably again also know that there are again equivalents in Europe and UK, but the American Green New Deal was proposed out of Congress by, in the House, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and many other co-sponsors, and in the Senate, Bernie Sanders, and again with other colleagues. But getting any of that through, even in the most modest forms, seems now increasingly difficult. Anyway, okay, so that's the political picture, or at least it's a piece of it. There's much more, but mixed in with this are the social and economic consequences of the pandemic that we've been talking about. The Biden campaign and many Democratic congressional campaigns tried to make the US election into a referendum on the scandalous absence of a coordinated public health policy. So they tried to make it a referendum on the pandemic. This doesn't seem to have succeeded. It may have at the presidential level. It's difficult to see what's actually driving all this, but it certainly hasn't succeeded in many of these local, right, in the congressional races. Instead, for example, Biden's slim victory in the key swing state of Pennsylvania seems to have pivoted around the combination of a robustly Democratic Black vote and the organizing of the Black community in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and other parts of the state, which is longstanding, together with the policy promise not to interfere with the fracking industry, the natural gas fracking industry, that's crucial to that state's economy at the moment. That means that the structural factors underlying the catastrophic American response to the pandemic, which are also those structural factors underlying the cynical inaction on climate, will not likely be addressed, at least at the systemic level, in the coming years. So, okay, what are these? Principal among these factors, this is what I want to kind of call attention to, is the plan not to plan. The plan is not to plan. So more in that sense than just deregulation or privatization, pretty more familiar in kind of classic understandings of neoliberalism. This is the practical and paradoxical sounding core of the neoliberal project. And in particular, the epistemological core that drives a lot of policymaking. And I think this is partly what's being contested in Chile. Its theoretical foundation is the proposition that markets are essentially massive information processors, like giant computers, self-organizing engines of rationality that replace public or collective planning with the free exercise, in this sense, in their terms, of individual choice, like buying and selling. This posture is symbolized in the US by the association of the supposedly individual refusal to wear a mask with the capital-friendly push to reopen, quote unquote, reopen the national economy simply because there is no choice. So this is where already the contradiction arises. The gesture to not wear a mask is frequently represented not just as like, personal preference, but an obligation that symbolizes the need to reopen the economy because there's no choice. When in fact there is a choice. Significant public spending, for example, to offset the economic losses of closing things down or slowing them down. In other words, neoliberalism is a collective project centered on the myth of the freely choosing individual. It's a collective project. This is very important to remember. So then there's the title of this panel. Okay, so we'll working our way. Others have mentioned this. The title of this panel, Globalized Digital Capitalism, as a dimension of what the overall symposium calls homework. In the US, as elsewhere, we could substitute in this title racialized for globalized or for digital and get something like racialized digital capitalism or globalized racial capitalism. And in order to get a concrete sense of the division of labor, and this area has already very eloquently, I think, shown this, the division of labor that separates so-called essential workers who are exposed daily in their service and manufacturing jobs, and in particular in the cases that you showed, to the greatest health risks, including those even more easily overlooked workers around the world who keep the digital part of capitalism's infrastructure humming, right? Digital is not just magic. So that we members of the professional managerial class can do our white collar work on Zoom. Made concrete, this picture confirms that politically race, class, and gender do not need to be intersected as though they are somehow ontologically separated. As scholars, we must learn, I think, to recognize instead the myriad strategic ways in which race, class, and gender have, and in particular in this case, if we're speaking about the pandemic, in terms of service and manufacturing work, this is gendered obviously in care work and both at home and in hospitals, that these have been disentangled for ideological reasons in the first place. It's not, our problem is not to put them back together, it's to understand how it was that these categories and vectors and factors have been disentangled and made into sort of like standalone identities and things like that, right? So let's say instead, racialized digital capitalism or global racial capitalism, and we can work our way down the line with other terms to capture the other dimensions of this, and conclude. I'll conclude now with some thoughts about what might come next to try to answer this question. Now, my response, my sort of brief thoughts I have here are really just a glimmer, but most of this, just to go back to New York here for a second, and say most of the small but significant group of democratic socialists newly elected at the state and local levels, whom I mentioned, are people of color who ran campaigns centered on racial justice, on gender justice, but even more concretely on radical decarceral police and prison reform, immigration reform, and housing reform of the sort that centers public or social housing, not neoliberal, affordable, or low-income housing. Impressively, all of these in turn, these campaigns were integrated into the sweeping and only apparently incommensurable program of a radical and radically democratic Green New Deal. Smart, organized, and committed, these young political activists represent the more public face of an insurgent movement, or really a kind of coalition of movements for which racial justice, gender justice, environmental justice are several sides of a multi-sided coin, represented by the growing ranks of so-called frontline or fence line communities around the world that, for example, are feeling the most immediate effects of climate change. Modestly, and we could say something similar about care work in its relationship to the green jobs platform of the Green New Deal. Modestly, these movements and their representatives, including these now elected figures, continue to show us concretely that indeed another world is possible. And in particular, another system is possible, modestly. Right? Okay, what's next then, both politically and for scholars of the built environment? Well, in both cases, I just want to conclude by returning that question, what's next, from its passive form, like as if we're just watching TV or something. It's actually a quote from The West Wing, if any of you are interested. Back to its more active and historical form, what is to be done? What are we to do? With an emphasis on the we. To which I offer this simple response at both levels. Seek the truth. Now, I know that sounds kind of absolute. Here I'm returning, in fact, and we can talk about Foucauldian biopolitics and specifically these terms. By which I mean neither absolute principles or laws or principles nor merely relative contingent ones, and get out of this again, artificial trap of was constructed out of postmodernism. But a dialectic of truth-telling. Foucault called it parousia. He referred to the Greek sense of both gossip and, telling the truth, that can only be done collectively. Remember then that the neoliberal project to which we remain subject, both as scholars and as political actors on screens like this, is a collective one that can only be, the neoliberalism is a collective project, which can only be met with a collective counter-project. That means finding ways to work together, both in the classroom and at large, in ways that favor cooperation over competition. And we can again speak in more detail about what that could mean. Anyway, remember also that even our most sincere and necessary efforts to intersect apparently divergent disparities of race, class, gender, and environment, except to some extent in their language, the calculated and in their kind of most reified form, identity-based neoliberal hypothesis that these are separate in the first place, like brands on a supermarket shelf. Respond instead with the hypothesis of a principled paradoxical equality, a universal equality in difference that is divided, which is to say made unequal every day. What we're dealing with is the practice of dividing every day, over and over again, the making unequal, not some sort of ontological inequality, actively and systematically in myriad ways. This equality, rather than assembled out of pre-existent atomized parts. Learn also to think relationally and systemically, and I also salute Peg, at all scales, so that even when we study isolated things or undertake isolated actions, we do so in relation to others and in response to the systemic injustices, to systemic injustices, not just symbolically particular ones. And finally, as scholars and shapers of the built environment, and shapers of thought around the built environment, remember that new contradictions and new conflicts, like those that riddle, for example, the climate question, beckon all of us together to seek new truths, the kinds of truths that can only arise from new questions, but also new actions. So, okay, thank you. So I guess we can chat for a little bit.
Thank you very much, Randall Martin. That was a very insightful and interesting and timely topic, really, about what's actually going on. Firstly, I would like to call on Vid Snidusik as our respondent to this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Martin. That was really interesting, and maybe I'll try to extend an homage to Mark Cousins with continuing political debate. And it's quite striking how you describe the American political situation to me. I'm Slovenian, for example, and last night there were violent riots in Ljubljana, which seem to be organized by our right-wing current president of the government, Janez Janša. because there are like a lot of tendencies to overthrow this right-wing government at the moment, because it's not dealing with pandemic at all, and because of other things as well. And then here on my screen, I see Anna, who probably has like a similar experience with Orban locking down the borders of Hungary, or I guess Nina could say something about Erdogan, or all these kind of politicians that are really kind of highlighting what's going on in the world right now, right? So, okay, this is first like a comment. It seems to me that there's a case of polarization going on, as you described as well, right? Left versus right, essential versus white collar. So my question or comment is, what is next? Like, how do we get AOC to be elected as the first female president of the United States? Like, what's the, what do we collectively, like really pragmatically do to narrow this divide and to get both essential and white collar, left and right, to see that from a new vantage point?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I have to begin responding with a personal anecdote. It just reminded me that way back in the previous century, I'll never forget sitting in the AA, lecture hall, listening to one of Mark's lectures when I was a student. I was a student in your guys' kind of situation at the AA in the graduate program there, doing exactly what you're doing, like, writing a thesis. And this was like, hundreds of years ago, and so much so that I vividly remember him saying, he's doing his talks about Dora's second dream or something, and Freud and space. And he makes some kind of a side comment, and by the way, there's this really interesting Slovenian guy who's currently sleeping on my couch who maybe you want to pay attention to. I think who he's talking about. He's talking about Zizek. And so, that kind of, let's say the Marxist International that Marx with Paul Hirst and others, the kind of Althusserian Foucauldians, or whatever we're going to describe them, Foucauldian Althusserians in London, we're connecting with people like Zizek and others. And so that's one thing, just, to make that into a kind of metaphor, it would be to continue to do what we're doing and connect and to compare and share solidarities in this sense. Because one of the things we share in terms of the group of your colleagues that you named, we share tyrants. We have, kind of all of our individual tyrants are sort of friends in one way or another, and they're all kind of getting together in this kind of, whatever it's called, a pre-fascist international or something like that. So what to do? Okay, this is you could hear my own concern about the results of the U.S. election, because the most direct electoral path for at least some, so just, this isn't radical, this is just basically reform work that people are trying to do, who have themselves been radicalized. And, there are different degrees of political consciousness, let's say, that's informing this. But the alliances that someone like AOC represents were set back by the fact that we didn't get more people like that in the Congress. There's a couple, actually. There's an interesting figure, Cori Bush in Missouri, who came out of Ferguson, and she's a really amazing organizer. But so one, but a mantra that has to be repeated is to organize. And this is different. I mean, this is, I think, generationally different. This was not the mantra when I was sitting listening to Mark in this is, I think, 1989, I think, or 90 maybe, in London. It was not what students were saying, because it was the moment, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then gradually it was in the middle of the neoliberal turn, here Thatcher into Blair and all that, and I mean there where you are, and here Bush into Clinton, etc. So that has changed, and there are a lot of steps along the way, like the anti-globalization protests of the battle in Seattle, things like that, earlier, and then in Around the World Occupy, etc. So the intelligence that this isn't just arising sui generis. The political intelligence that we're talking about it was formed in some of these cases earlier on in other movements, or in much more local situations. Actually, let me put just so you know if you're interested in looking what I'm talking about. I had the link. There's just the other day there was an article in Jacobin. Maybe you guys know Jacobin, the journal, profiling some of these figures in New York who I'm talking about. Let me, if I can get back to the Zoom screen, I will put it in the chat. And where'd the chat go? Okay, chat, sorry. Cool. These are glimmers of hope. They're very local, but this matters in New York, for example, because on prison reform and decarceral practice, abolition-based practice. One of the things it looks like they're going to come short of is a strong, what's called the supermajority in the state Senate, in which some of these guys could join forces and push through against Andrew Cuomo's, our local COVID hero, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York State, against his prison policies. There's some stronger advocates for bail reform and things like that. There were some races that were lost on those issues too. So, and I really do think it's nuts and bolts like that, but it's not just, I do think, okay, take that and think about the epistemologies of scale that we are used to working with in built environment. I think this is kind of analogous to what, Ire, you were talking about with thinking geographically and spatially. We're used to thinking in a kind of telescopic, powers of 10 sort of idea of scale. You start, something small happens and gradually, incrementally it builds up. That's not actually what happened with the Green New Deal or with AOC. That particular phenomenon is interesting and complicated and full of contradictions in its own way, because it's somewhat tied to gentrification in that part of Queens, as are some of these other races. One of whom I should add, because this is again a somewhat more personal connection, Zohran Mamdani, who's profiled partly in this article, it's a name some of those of you who read postcolonial studies might recognize, and in particular African studies. I don't know if you recognize the name Mahmoud Mamdani. There's a Columbia connection here, and my son, our son, Kadabri and my son, Neelan, has been working with Zohran for like 3 years now on several different campaigns, and was really very closely. And so this is one reason we've been involved with some of this stuff. And these are young, smart, idealistic, but also very realistic, people who are doing in their day jobs like community organizing work, and Zoran was doing anti-foreclosure work in Queens before he ran for office. So, I do think that one has to be able to think scale in a more I sometimes will say kaleidoscopic fashion, rather than a telescopic fashion. Not necessarily because it's always going to turn out like that, but because, and not in some fantasy about butterfly effects and things like that, which I know architects have talked about, but strategically. And I'll just say one more thing, that I do think that these, and what I've been trying to do with this little talk here, is that these are teachable, these cases. That I think about these as object lessons. It's not like this is a case study of something that's necessarily happening at a larger scale. It isn't really, unfortunately. It's happening in New York, basically in Philadelphia, a little bit in Chicago, a few other places. But it's an object lesson in what could happen. You see what I mean? Yeah. So anyway, okay.
Thank you so much for this nice response. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Vid, and thank you for the response, Reinhold. I'm going to open the floor to some questions from the cohort. And Anna, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. First of all, can you hear me?
A little bit.
All right, I will try to speak to my laptop. So so much, first of all, for your talk. It was very inspiring, both as part of a cohort and just generally like a politically active someone to listen to it. And you kind of, my question, I had the question before, and it's, you partly answered it, but I will then rephrase it. So I am currently working on, just to give you a background about my question, why I'm asking it is, I'm working on building in Hungary a system of cooperatives now with an association called the Solidarity Economy Association, because it's an association of young people, to be fair, from various fields, because like trying to change the economic which we operate in, rather than just giving aid outside of, I suppose, neoliberal economy. And what I experienced is that, like, we've been working on now an actually actively working cooperative for roughly like more than like roughly 8 months, let's say. And what we experienced is that, like, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, actually informal economy started boosting up, and people started organically doing things that we tried to organize. And so it was in a way easier, for example, to influence people into trying to take part in cooperatives, which obviously in a post-communist country like Hungary, it's hard to sell. I have to say, we usually don't use the word cooperative. Right. We say communities. But my question would be is that, do you see this kind of, I don't know, informal change in how people participate in economies? Meaning, for example, like from small things of sharing things because you can't leave your apartment, you can't leave your block, so you have to talk with your neighbors, to a bit more organized things. For example, what I experienced is with childcare, for example, of strangers organizing in blocks, again, usually around habitats, how to care for children, how to care for shopping and these kind of things. So do you experience this, for example, in the US also?
Yeah, I do think that you know, a kind of mutual aid, networks of mutual aid are forming, you know, under, you know, dire circumstances and very difficult circumstances. I mean, I would say that these kind of questions, and it's a great and very interesting example that you're offering the work that you're doing. And so, first of all, thank you for doing the work that you're doing. But you know, that they shade in different degrees. You know, so for example, the kind of care work that nurses have been doing formally in their jobs has shaded, you know, out beyond the hospitals and you know, into homes and so on and so forth. And in particular, this is in the case of elderly people or people who are homebound in you know, for health reasons. In any case, the fact that they can't have somebody, you know, a home health aide come and take a look. However, this is that economy, that particular economy. In fact, Bernie Sanders, when he was still, you know, he's running in the primary, highlighted the home healthcare economy as one of the most exploitative. And they're super underpaid, and you know, and again, they're kind of analogs. Like, okay, and then there's the sharing economy, which just got a big boost in California because they turned down the initiative that was. They have ballot referendums there, and that was meant to protect Uber drivers and, you know, Uber, Lyft, and so on, and force those companies to actually hire them as formal employees. So, you know, I think this is analogous quite much to what Ira was also talking about, that I think these kinds of formation, these kind of organizations can also be used to make demands of institutions, and in particular state institutions. So with housing, I'll just give you the one you know, kind of bit about housing. You know, for example, it's not exactly the same as what you're describing. In the US, the only place they use the word cooperatives when it comes to housing is on very expensive buildings on Fifth Avenue. So you know, because the rich people have cooperatives, they are co-owners of buildings. But but there are other, there's something called the community land trust that's become a kind of paradigm that's similar, in which groups, get together, community gets together, they buy land, and this typically outside of cities, but as an alternative model to the sheer market-based stuff or whatever the state offers in affordable housing. So, but there, I think one of the challenges is when you sit that side by side with neoliberal state policy, if it doesn't get turned back as a demand back onto the state, and essentially saying that the state, with its economies of scale, with its formal, political responsibilities and resources, should be doing this. And in our field, I think that one of the great scandals of the neoliberal, I think it's to me, it's like sort of the scandal of postmodernism and the neoliberal turn. And I think it probably goes around the world. Maybe you guys have some counterexamples that you can hold up. There are really interesting counterexamples in Eastern Europe, both before and after the 89. But anyway, is housing, and it's specifically the different ways in which social housing was not just privatized, but stigmatized, turned into in this kind of theological sense, the target of a kind of moral outrage that weaponized the critique of segregation. These were, in the US for sure, utterly segregated, so this famous image of the destruction of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex. So that has meant that for I'd say at least 2 generations now, depending how you count generations, maybe more, certainly for students that I've taught over the years now at Columbia, it's been almost impossible to say public housing in an affirmative way and to defend that category, even as one practices the kind or experiments in the way that you're describing. And I have to say, I don't know if this also, this is my kind of little bit conversation with Mark coming out a little too. The question is, where's Foucault here? I have kind of parallel discussions with other Foucauldian friends of mine, and I count myself on that team to some extent. Because the Foucauldian critique I think also needs to be situated and it does change with Mbembe and necropolitics, but it needs to be situated in its kind of pure form in France in the 60s and 70s as a critique of the French welfare state. It's paternalism, it's surveillance, all the kind of power, the will to power of the welfare state. But you move that to a more purely neoliberal environment like the US, in which the left is just trying to hold on to whatever is left of the welfare state and then rebuild it in a more inclusive fashion. And that critique needs to be modified. It doesn't need to be, it's not some finger pointing blame game. It needs to be modified because all critical theory is situated. Just the same way Adorno's, the interpretation of fascism in Germany was not the same as California when they moved to LA and wrote the Dialectic of Enlightenment. So, I think if we use our tools in this way, our critical tools, and then articulate them with examples like the one you're offering, Anna, then we'd be forced, it's difficult to just reproduce cliches, and but either theoretical cliches or political ones, that would demonize social housing or the state is always the enemy or something like that. State power is very complex. I mean, Nietzsche knew this. So why not we? Okay, anything?
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for the response. The next question will be from Ken. He has a question, so I just want to for that.
Right.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you, Reinhold, for the very inspiring talk. Just to give a disclaimer, I am from Chile. I'm Chilean.
Very good. I was going to ask if anybody report. What's going on? Come on, you got to help us out.
So my question might be a little biased, but we'll see how it goes. I wanted to thank you first for making this parallel between the Chilean referendum that just happened and the US elections, because indeed they have very strong ties in a way that not everybody knows.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to comment or discuss with you was this notion that you mentioned about the pervasiveness of neoliberalism that David Harvey has spoken of.
Yeah.
And in Chile, at least, one of the big victories of the social movement that is trying to overthrow the constitution by Pinochet is the change in perception in the general people, in understanding that neoliberalism is not common sense, as David Harvey says. It can be changed somehow, and Chileans are trying to do that through this referendum and, well, through lots and lots of social activism. I think maybe one of the reasons that this happens is because Chileans see one particular origin for neoliberalism, and that is the regime, the Pinochet regime, and of course the Chicago Boys influence. And I wanted to know if you see something like this happening in the States, because what we are doing in Chile is basically trying to change the system. I don't know if we will be able to do it, I hope so, but it's quite a strong ambition.
Yeah.
I wanted to know if something like this would be possible in the States, because it's quite a different context, of course.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I'll add, I'm very glad to hear your report, and I was going to say I was talking with my friend and colleague Enrique Walker, who maybe you guys know.
Yeah, I know him. Yeah.
Yeah, the other day about the referendum and about Mark, because we both studied with Mark in different ways. Enrique did his PhD with Mark, and so we were just having this kind of conversation in a sense in memory of Mark. You know, like this is the kind of stuff we talk about. And he was, you know, Enrique's not a particularly optimistic guy, you know, but I was very, you know, heartened to see him, you know, sort of a little more optimistic about at least some aspects. Now, you know, as you're saying, this in the Chilean, you know, situation is the outcome of its years of activism, and more specifically the movements in 2019. And so that hasn't happened in the same way in the US. You could ask, for example, does the movement for Black Lives lead at some point in the US trajectory, hypothetically at least, towards systemic critique of neoliberalism? I don't know. I mean, you know, yes, from the point of view of some of the activists that I was just, you know, referring to and you know, that are mentioned in that article, but for sure, but they're speaking your language, but and they're also of roughly your generation, I would say too. So but this sort of broader public sphere in the US tends actively to separate these things out and to isolate issues, break them down into identitarian forms or other sort of, you know, put them in boxes. And so anytime you hear the word neoliberalism used in the US in the public sphere, it's used in very vague ways. It's just understood as a sort of slogan of political economic critique. But to be precise on what we're talking about and to take your cue, so I did mention, you know, there are these two, you know, more than two, but at least there's different ways of understanding the concept. One, the David Harvey version it tends to put a little more emphasis on privatization and deregulation of industry, and this, you know, of societal and economic processes. And in many ways, that may be that's the sort of in the kind of editorial page sense, the you know, soundbite sense, the Chicago Boys thing. But as a lot of new scholarship has shown since Foucault's work on neoliberalism, but a lot of new work, and you know, that it's very much worth reading, like Philip Murawski or Quinn Slobodian and various other economic historians have emphasized the cultural dimensions of neoliberalism. I mean, Foucault really basically treats neoliberalism as the way a cultural historian would. He, you know, he defines it as the entrepreneurship of the self, You become basically a walking CV, and you go around taking your CV, from office to office. And the way in which, one way, I actually wrote a little bit about this in the Urban Apparatus as one of the essays there. In the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the names, let's see if I can get it, sorry, that sometimes, the practice in the streets is, here, I'll get the Wikipedia version, is reciting names, right? And every now and then you'll hear the name of Amadou Diallo. So who is Amadou Diallo? He was somebody who was murdered by police in the Bronx in the 90s. Like I forget the exact, it says it here, the exact year. But he was in a sense a kind of paradigm of neoliberal migration. He was a subject of neoliberal capitalism. He came to New York. He was Ghanaian, I believe, and he came to New York to get a job in the computer industry, to become like a computer tech kind of guy. And he was taking classes down on Canal Street, how to fix computers and do the software and stuff. And one night he was accosted. He lived in the Bronx. He was in a brownstone. He was going into his kind of doorway, and he was accosted by a group of plainclothes police. And apparently, by the court testimony, he went to reach into his pocket, and they claimed that they thought he had a gun, and they showed there was some unbelievable, obscene, barbaric, execution that they carried out of this poor man. And it's entirely possible, at least this one that he might have been as a subject of the post-colony, reaching for his papers. Thinking almost reflexively, I need to show you that I belong here. Right. That's neoliberalism. And so is this about migration? Is it about race? Is it about class? They're not separate in the first place in this one body, and nor in those bullets. And that was because that's the other side of it, is the kind of police work. That's our former mayor Rudy Giuliani who installed those practices in New York, and then took them around the world. And he's the kind of police version of the Chicago Boys, along with some of his friends, William Bratton and so on. So anyway, so that's and that could be seen as a more cultural, if we're talking about race and stuff, dimension of neoliberalism. So this is where I do think we need all the tools in the toolkit to think these questions. And part of our task is to assemble them and then build something with these tools. Thank you.
Sorry, I know we're short on time.
No,
I
whatever.
Just wanted to comment.
Like
I just wanted to comment that, I've noticed that one of the interesting things that is happening in Chile is that neoliberalism has become very, the perception on neoliberalism is quite wide. And for example, in architecture, people are actually questioning monuments, places, buildings, based on this.
Like monuments to the Chicago Boys, yeah.
Exactly, yes. And as you said, I feel like in the States, it's not necessarily the case. It's more about compartmentalism.
Understood in that sense. We're nowhere near that. You guys have to teach us and our students.
Well, I don't know. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronald and Kim, for a lively discussion on the last question. Because obviously we're running over time, I'm sorry there are no more questions I can actually point out to. But if you want to continue the discussion, obviously we can continue after the live stream. I now just want to pass on for final comments to Paul again. Thank you for allowing me to chair this part of the discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks, Reinhold, above all, for a very stimulating talk and discussion. And I wish it could have gone on longer, but time is our enemy. It's been a wide-ranging discussion, starting with Sam Cooke and ending with Foucault. So that's probably how things ought to be in the world. The next thing we need to do is to have Ken briefly describe the next steps for putting out our publication, because this is only the first stage. The symposium is only the first stage of a two-stage process. So I'll hand over to Ken to tell you all about that.
Thank you, Paul. Let me share my screen. Okay. Now, before finishing this event, I want to talk about how the accompanying publication of the symposium has been handled, and also expand a bit on what I talked about on the first session. Now, as you may know, the symposium is part of a tradition that celebrates the work of the graduating cohort at the end of each academic year. Clearly, the impacts of COVID-19 have changed how we have conducted this year's event, as we opted for an online format instead. Additionally, we also pondered on how to approach the publication of the cohort's work. In past years, the live symposium would have been accompanied by a printed book. However, considering our current situation, we felt that it was imperative to restructure our dissemination practices towards the digital. Taking the opportunity given by this time's heightened virtual connectivity. Sorry about that. Thus, in order to contribute to the deepening growth of online archives, we have created an online repository to store and showcase the work of this year's cohort. This website will feature a straightforward, yet visually appealing interface, and we hope it will evolve as a centralized stage for the dissemination of the work produced by this program. Hence, we have devised this as an adaptable resource that will be passed on to the next cohort for their use as a publication platform. In addition, we will include all the publications made on former symposiums as an attempt to create a complete timeline of this tradition online. So, bartlettarchistory.com will be live on the 13th of November, and then you will be able to visit it and see the work produced by the cohort. In the meantime, you're welcome to bookmark and share the site. Lastly, on behalf of the organizing team, I wish to thank all the speakers on both nights for the notable contributions, the cohort as well for the participation during the entire process, and the entire academic staff for the guidance during this very eventful year. Particularly, thank you to Peg Ross for her supervision through the organization of this event. I would also like to thank Laura Cherry, Therese Jones, and Abby Luther, part of the Bartlett staff who helped us make this event and publication possible. And personally, I want to thank the entire organizing team for their hard work and dedication during this process. So thank you everybody for joining us during the celebration, and I hope you have a good night. Thank you.